Welcome, everybody. I'm Lisa Carreño. I'm the president and CEO of United Way of the Wine Country, and I'm also the vice chair of Los Yang, Sonoma County. Thank you all for spending a little bit of time with so much going on today. We know that your time is valuable. We know there's a debate, there's a World Series. Your families are important to you and need your time and attention too. And we're grateful to have you with us. Los Yang's mission has been for its 11 years, all about building bridges in the community, bringing the community together to raise awareness about our common interests. We are intentionally inclusive and we are an intentionally diverse organization. We're grateful that we have Latinx and allies from all over the region joining us tonight to talk about this incredibly important topic, the real cost of living in California, and what it means to make ends meet here, the challenges of making ends meet here. And this is an especially important conversation for us to be having because the more and more we look around the community, especially after 7 disasters in 3 years, we're looking at something like the middle class disappearing and the working classes having more and more of a struggle to make ends meet, to support their families, and to make sure that they can sustain their lives and thrive. So we're thrilled to have United Ways of California, my colleagues, Peter Manzo and Henry Gascon, presenting on the real cost measure. And they'll explain more about that when they're introduced in just a few minutes. In the meantime, I want to take a moment and thank our sponsors who've made it possible for us to present tonight's program. The Community Foundation, Sonoma County, the Luther Burbank Center for the Performing Arts, Sonoma Media Investments, Petaluma Healthcare Center, Redwood Credit Union, Kaiser Permanente, the Federated Indians of Grayton Rancheria, Rebuild North Bay Foundation, the CTE Foundation, and a new sustaining member, the Peter Haas Jr. Fund. We could not do what we do. This is our 16th virtual program since we began to shelter in place in March. We couldn't do any of this without our sustaining and premier members, and for that, mil gracias. I also want to take a moment and share a little historical perspective. Last year, Los Yang announced the launch of the Latino Family Scorecard for Sonoma County. It has 5 critical factors that are being measured over the next decade. Political participation and representation in political offices, education, financial stability, neighborhood engagement, health and the environment. These 5 sectors are interconnected, and things don't happen in one without having an impact on the other. Every program that Los Yang does is intended to help you understand one of these major factors and how your understanding can contribute to your participation in helping to make things better. Ultimately, our goal is to lift every boat, to make sure that Sonoma County is a community in which everyone has access to the resources they need and the support to thrive and to create and build lives here and families that also thrive. That said, I want to introduce my colleague on the Los Yang Sonoma County Board of Directors, Fernando Carrillo. Fernando is a financial advisor with Merrill Lynch. He joined the firm in 2016. He's been a financial advisor since 1998. His focus is on individuals, families, and small businesses. And we're grateful that he's bringing his expertise as a financial advisor to this incredibly important conversation. Mil gracias for joining us. I hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Lisa. It's my pleasure, really an honor to be with you here today. As many people know, this program is going to help us, understand something we already know, which is we live in California, which is a very expensive place to live. But I'm amazed that this program is going to help us open our eyes to the extent of the crisis. I didn't really find any other way to express that it is a crisis that affects everybody, but in particular is way more acute with communities of color, including our Comunidad Latina. I'm also convinced that it will help us understand how United Way of California and our very local chapter of United Way of Sonoma, Mendocino, Lake, Humboldt, and Del Norte counties work, producing invaluable data, amazing online tools, but more importantly, taking action to change this reality. This knowledge, as Lisa mentioned too, helps Los 100 tracking how the Latinx population is being affected with our very own Sonoma County Latino scorecard. Without further ado, what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and introduce both Mr. Peter Manzo and Mr. Henry Gascon, so that they can really give us great info for us. So Peter Manzo is the president and CEO of United Way of California. Previously, Mr. Manzo was the director of strategic initiatives for the Advancement Project, a civil rights action tank, I love that, expanding opportunity for low-income and vulnerable people. He also acted as executive director and general counsel of the Center for Nonprofit Management and directing attorney of community development programs for public counsel. Mr. Manzo is a graduate of Boalt Hall School of Law of the University of California at Berkeley. He also is a graduate of the London School of Economics, where he received a master's degree in political sociology, and the University of Notre Dame, where he received a bachelor's degree in government. And Mr. Henry Gascon. Henry is the director of program and policy development at United Way of California, conducting policy research and analysis. He is the co-author of this study, which will really help us understand in more depth all of this amazing information. Previously, Mr. Gascon was a policy analyst at Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority and director of Empower, also down there in LA. Henry holds a bachelor degree in history and international relationships from Holy Names University in Oakland, and he holds a master's in public administration, specializing in policy analysis from the Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service at New York University. But enough chat from my end. Peter, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome and good evening, everyone. We're really happy to be here. I want to thank you all for having us, and especially thank Lisa for inviting us to come up and speak with all of you. We're really excited to share the framework that we've developed with the real cost measure. I'll say a few brief introductory remarks, and then Henry will take us through the measure results and what it says for California and for your region up there in Sonoma County in the wine country. The real cost measure study, what we aim to do with it is address some of the shortcomings of the federal poverty level. So many people are familiar with the federal poverty level. The challenge with the federal poverty level are a couple of challenges. One is it doesn't really take into account local cost of living, right? So it's much more expensive. Prices could be as much as 30% higher in California as in other parts of the country. The other thing it doesn't do is it doesn't tell you where we want people to be, right? So it doesn't set a goal for what it would look like if households were thriving and financially stable, if they were able to meet the costs of a decent standard of living. So what we do is we calculate the local cost of living for key inputs for any household: housing, transportation, food, healthcare, childcare, miscellaneous for your utilities and mobile phone and so on, right? And then we also look at the census data and we analyze how many families of specific types fall below that measure, right? And again, the goal is just to illustrate what it would cost for a typical family to meet the cost of a decent standard of living. So that's kind of why we do it. And this is exactly the reason we do it, to have local conversations with communities about who's struggling in a community and what can be done to help them. So I'll stop here and turn it over to Henry.
Thank you so much, Pete. And once again, I want to thank Lucien for hosting this wonderful series to help Latino families throughout the region. I want to thank the wonderful work of Lisa Carreño for her leadership at United Way of the Wine Country. We're so grateful for her leadership there. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and do a share screen and go ahead and get started with the presentation, if that works. And let me see if you're able to see my screen. Great. Does everybody see that? So in today's presentation, we're going to go ahead and do an overview of the real cost measure. And Pete just did a wonderful job in explaining some of the deficiencies of the official poverty measure. Many of you may know that the official poverty measure was founded during the 1960s during Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. And in a very famous in his 1964 inaugural address, he declared that war on poverty across the United States. So if you're going to declare a war on poverty, you need some sort of an instrument to measure it by. So a famous statistician named Molly Orshansky in the Social Security Administration looked at the cost of food because that was one of the biggest household expenses for families back in the 1950s and 60s. So essentially, she used the cost of 3 baskets of food to determine the official poverty measure. And that's, for all intents and purposes, we're still using that official poverty measure today, and it's adjusted for inflation every single year. So it doesn't take into account the cost of housing. It doesn't take into account the cost of childcare, healthcare, transportation, and other basic needs that we so desperately need in our lives. So in this analysis, I'm going to go ahead and review some of the key findings from our study when we incorporate those basic needs. And at the end, we'll explore some of the interactive resources. So this isn't just a report that we want to lay on the shelf. This is a report that we actually want to have people mobilize around to really talk about the cost of livings in our communities, not only with our friends, but with our family members, but also with everyday people that we encounter with, elected officials, and more. So about the real cost measure, it's obviously a far more measure of poverty throughout California because it takes into account the cost of housing, healthcare, childcare, and other basic needs. And the primary focus of the real cost measure is on working households. And we find that pretty much no matter where you live in California, most of the households, at least 90% of them, for households that are below the real cost measure, most of them are employed. So we find throughout the entire state that 90% of families below the real cost measure are employed. But how they work really varies by household and by where they're working. So there could be one person working full-time, there could be a couple of family members working part-time, and they often work different hours throughout the entire day, struggling every day to make ends meet. And the data is available at the state, region, county, and neighborhood level. So this is one of the few self-sufficiency reports that actually goes into the neighborhood level. So we can take a look at within Sonoma County and within Los Angeles County to take a look at the disparities within neighborhoods themselves. And lastly, through a great data team, we've calculated about 1,200 household budgets for all 58 counties in California. And that ranges from 1 person in a household to 20 persons in a household. So it's really robust, and the real cost measure is really determined by how many people are actually comprise a household. So I'm not going to wonk out too much in terms of how we calculated this, but I do want to emphasize that we use publicly available government data to calculate all of the findings from the real cost measure. So when we look at the household budgets, for example, we look at HUD data. We use fair market rent rates to determine the cost of housing. We use the low cost food plan, also by HUD, to look at the cost of food. We use the consumer expenditure survey to look at average cost of healthcare and for transportation. And then we usually put about 10% on top of that for basic needs. And we've gotten really good in terms of being able to calculate the impact of taxes on our household budgets, including the ability to incorporate federal, state, and payroll taxes in addition to childcare tax credits into the calculation of the real cost measure. So that's the first thing that we do. We calculate our household budgets. And then secondly, we use probably the most statistically accurate survey in the entire world to look at which people are struggling. And that's the American Community Survey, which is conducted by the US Census Bureau. And from there, we can actually take a look at how many percent, what percentage of Latinos are below the real cost measure? How many children, how many households with children under the age of 6 are struggling? And we'll be taking a look at and preview of that demographic data a little bit later today. So this is the third time that we've released the real cost measure study. We've done it in 2015, 2017. We released our most recent version in 2019, last year. So all of these are pre-pandemic numbers. So we're looking forward to continuing the work of the real cost measure and finding out what the impact of this analysis is on working families in the years to come. So now we've been able to incorporate payroll taxes. We've gotten really good in terms of calculating food budgets. So we're now able to distinguish how a toddler eats versus a teenager and how that determines the real cost measure. We're able to now have the ability to run annual demographic data with the real cost measure through structured data. And we've now incorporated real cost measure to interactively look at all the rich data that is now available with this study. So let's take a look at our first finding. And let's take a look at a household that has 2 adults and 2 teenagers in Sonoma County. And the first thing that I want you to take a look at is that red line. So on average, this is for a family of 4 below the real cost measure. This family of 4 with 2 adults and 2 teenagers would need over $60,000 to make ends meet when you take into account the cost of housing, healthcare, childcare, transportation, all the basic needs that we just talked about. But on average, the average income for this family of 4 below the real cost measure, you can actually take a look at it at the blue lines below. On average, they get about $20,000 in wages, about $1,250 in SSI, Social Supplemental Security income. They get over $16,000, almost $17,000 in interest and other forms of income. And they also get about $5,600 in average through the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is one of the most successful anti-poverty programs that has been established here in the US. I would probably say EITC and Social Security have really helped families get out of poverty. But even that, even if this family of 4 was able to fully utilize all of this income, it's about $43,750 in income, they would still face about a $25,000 gap to make ends meet. So the real question for us is how do they do it? How do they struggle? How do they manage to get through every day? Well, just like many people, they make sacrifices and compromises every single day. Sometimes they'll try to negotiate with their landlord to renegotiate rent for the next month. They'll skip out on food, right? So maybe if they're spending $150 on food, maybe they'll try to spend about $100 on food next month. And often they'll go ahead and just abandon things like school supplies, or they'll look at other things that they could skip out on, such as a high school prom. They won't be able to afford the dress for their daughter in order to help meet basic needs. So they make decisions every single day, and unfortunately, at times they even resort to payday lending firms to seek out loans, which unfortunately puts them further in debt. So let's take a look at another household configuration. This time, let's take a look at 2 adults, 1 preschooler, and 1 school-age child. And let's take a look how Sonoma County fares with 3 different counties using this household configuration of 2 adults, 1 preschooler, and 1 school-age child. So you can actually see this family of 4 would now need about $90,000 to make ends meet. And one of the biggest factors is the cost of childcare. When you previously we had 2 teenagers. Now, when you put in the picture of 1 preschooler and 1 school-age child, they obviously need childcare. And for the purposes of the real cost measure, we're assuming that they're using a licensed childcare facility. But in reality, we know that most family and friends who are struggling, often rely on family and friends to help with their childcare. But take a look at the cost of housing on average for this family of 4 in Sonoma County. It's about over $18,800. Immediately after that, almost matching the cost of housing is the cost of childcare at over $17,000. Then you can on average, healthcare costs for this family of four is about $9,500. And you can see food costs about $12,000 for the year. So that's Sonoma County for $90,000. If you take the same family of four, of two adults, one preschooler and one school-age child, it would take them about $72,000 in income if they lived in Fresno County. They would need about $98,000 in income in Orange County in Southern California. And if they lived in Contra Costa County, one of the wealthiest areas of the entire state, this family of four would need about $104,000 in income to meet basic needs. So two things really matter with the real cost measure. How many people in your household, and what ages the children are especially, and where you live. And those are really key components in terms of what it means to make ends meet throughout the entire state. So looking at Sonoma County again, let's take a look at three different configurations and break it down even further. So in the left-hand column, we have two adults. In the middle, we have two adults, a preschooler and a school-age child, like we just talked about. And then lastly, we have two adults, a school-age child, and one teenager. Take a look at the difference between the last two columns, and look at how the cost of childcare really has an impact on a family's ability to make ends meet. You can see the cost of childcare went from over $17,000 with one preschooler and one school-age child. But when they grow up to become one school-age child and one teenager, the cost of childcare decreases about $7,000. And you can actually just take a look that the household budget the difference there is well over $12,000 between those two different family types. So that's a really big story in terms of the cost of childcare and the cost of living in Sonoma County. So here's the big finding that we want to present to you and to keep in mind. So I just looked up the average poverty rate in Sonoma County right now. It's about 10%. And in California, it's about 12%. But we find in the entire state of California, up to 37% of families do not earn enough to meet basic needs when you take into account the cost of housing, healthcare, childcare, transportation, and the basic needs we've been talking about. But when we put a number on that, that's over over 3.8 million households. That's a lot of people who are struggling every single day, who are trying to figure out every single month how they're going to pay the rent, how they're going to pay for tuition, for school supplies, and all the basic needs that we rely on every single day. If we were to take a look at Sonoma County, it's a little bit better than the state average. About 28% of families in Sonoma County are struggling to meet basic needs. When we put a number on that, it's about 43,000 families. So one talking point that I always encourage nonprofits to use, or social service providers, especially in Sonoma County, is why do you do what you do? The answer is because 28% of families in our community are struggling to meet basic needs, and I want to help them out, and this is what we're doing about it. And you could talk about all of your wonderful programmatic work that you're doing in your nonprofit. So here's a map of the entire state of California when we use neighborhood clusters. And I use the term neighborhood clusters, but there's a technical name for it. It's called public use microdata areas by the US Census Bureau. And all this means is that they consolidate neighborhoods to get a sample size of 100,000 people to make it statistically accurate. So in California, there's 265 neighborhoods. And these PUMAs, or public use microdata areas, are determined every 10 years at the decennial census. So we just completed our census just a few days ago, and we're very eager to see how these neighborhood clusters are going to change over the next decade. And I believe those results are going to be coming out at the end of 2021. So we're looking forward to seeing how California is going to be changing over time. But overall, there you see the 37% of families, 37% of families who are struggling throughout the state. And you can actually see the deep degree of struggle primarily in the Central Valley. You can see them in Riverside and San Bernardino counties. And one of the deepest areas is in the heart of South Central Los Angeles. So let's take a look at a couple of the two extremes here in California. Only 12% of families in the community of San Ramon and Danville in Contra Costa County are struggling to meet basic needs. versus 87% of families in the community of Southeast LA, East Vernon, which is in that whole South Central LA area, really experiences a high degree of historical poverty. So let's take a look at Sonoma County. And the US Census Bureau has identified 3 neighborhood clusters, Windsor, Healdsburg, and Sonoma. And then there's Santa Rosa right in the middle, and there's Petaluma, Ronet Park, and Cotati right in the south there. And you can actually take a look at these 3 different neighborhoods. They're all pretty comparable in terms of the percentage of families who fall below the real cost measure. It's about 25% in Windsor, Healdsburg, and Sonoma, and 32% of families are struggling to make ends meet in the Santa Rosa neighborhood cluster. And it's pretty much the city of Santa Rosa. Here's the big finding, which would be especially tangent for the work that Lucien does, is that 57% of Latino households in California do not earn enough to meet basic needs. This is huge, and it's a big important aspect in terms of who's struggling. It's primarily the Latino population. And when we put a number on that, that's over 1.8 million households throughout the entire state. So here's what it looks like in Sonoma County. And it's about 48% of Latino households do not earn enough in Sonoma County to meet basic needs, compared to about 23% of white households. These are the 2 ethnic groups that we primarily have. And just for your information, we look at it, usually try to reach a sample size of about 5,000 people for other populations, such as African American households and Asian American households. But we didn't get up to that 5,000 household population in Sonoma County. So we're only able to display the Latino and white households here for the purposes of this presentation. But let's change the story around. That was a percentage view. This is the numeric view. So about over 14,000 Latino households are struggling in Sonoma County, but look at the white households. The number's really inverse. It's almost 26,000 white households who are struggling to meet basic needs in Sonoma County. So that really tells an interesting story in terms of the degree of struggle within each of the ethnic groups. But when you take a look at the numeric differences, it tells quite a different story in terms of the degree of struggle. So we know that educational attainment for a long time has a big impact on who's struggling. So the more education that we have, the less likely we are to struggle. And I think this graphic really represents it well. So during the 1950s and 60s, when we had more unions and labor protections, most families could pretty much get by with a high school diploma. But now as we're well into the 21st century, that's no longer the case. Almost 70% of households headed by a person without a high school diploma are struggling to meet basic needs. 37% with a high school diploma are struggling, 30% with some college. But look at the last number, which I think is pretty high. 16% of families with a person with at least a bachelor's degree are really struggling. About a month ago, I was listening to a webinar by the head of the San Francisco Federal Reserve, and she was asked some questions about, who's going to really be able to make it through the pandemic, and who's going to be left behind economically in the ability to make ends meet. And she answered, well, probably the most important indicator is having a bachelor's degree. Having a 4-year degree will probably mean that you'll be more likely to work virtually at home over the next few months and maybe the next couple of years. And we're probably going to see huge impacts in the service sector and in retail. So many of those are seeing declining numbers. And one of the things that we've learned from families who are below the who are below the real cost measure is their employment practices. So we talked about how one family can have one person working, they could have 2 persons in a household working part-time, but seasonal changes also make a big impact as well. So as as we head into the holiday season, usually retailers hire more during the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays. And then January comes along and they're asked to reduce their hours. So what we're seeing is seasonal cycles in terms of employment for these families below the real cost measure, where they have to make constant financial adjustments throughout the calendar year based upon what's available with employment. Citizenship status is also a big story in terms of our ability to make ends meet. And we see here in Sonoma County, 52% of non-citizens are struggling to make ends meet. And one of the things that we've learned is the ability to speak English goes a long way in terms of being able to access public services that are available for many families. So for many foreign language speakers, they'll often rely on their children to be ambassadors for that family, to access family services, to ask, when our after school programs are available? What hours are they? What resources do we have for sports? It's often that child who actually has better English skills was able to, and has better internet skills, were able to look around and identify what resources may be available for families to help the family make ends meet. Here's another big finding, is a challenge that single mothers face. So single mothers are heroes. They're not only breadwinners, but they're also the entire emotional support system for their families. But we find in Sonoma County, almost 70% of single moms are struggling to make ends meet. And if we put a number on that, that's about 6,700 families. Another big challenge is households with children under the age of 6. And this is really critical because this is where the cost of childcare really comes along. And we have to invest so much, not only in the cognitive resources, but also in the childcare. But we find about 52% of households with children under the age of 6 are struggling to meet basic needs. And that's about 8,500 in Sonoma County. We're also glad to partner with UCLA and the Fielding School of Public Health. And through their wonderful team, they've helped develop the modern version of the Elder Index, which determines how seniors are faring in the ability to make ends meet. And they use the same metrics that we do in terms of using the cost of housing, healthcare, childcare, transportation of the basic needs. And we find about 24% of seniors are struggling to meet basic needs in Sonoma County. And one of the things that we've learned about seniors is that the first basic need that they're more likely to skip out on is a prescription drugs. So if they're doing that, that could obviously have very profound short and long-term impacts on their health, which could certainly impact their longevity as well. So next we want to talk about housing, and housing is obviously one of the biggest factors of one of the biggest barriers for families to make ends meet throughout the entire state. And historically, we've kind of determined as a society that we shouldn't be spending more than 30% of our income in housing, and it's what we call housing burden. But we find that in California, almost 40% of families are paying at least 30% of their income on housing. And that number is significantly above the real cost measure. It's over 4.2 million. And we all know how the cost of housing really varies throughout the entire state, from Sonoma County to Fresno, Los Angeles to Redding, and where you live really matters in terms of your ability to reach housing. So here's the neighborhood cluster map of housing burden throughout California. And you can see some of the deep pockets of red where so many families are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And the two extremes in this case, statewide, only 22% of families in the community of Sunnyvale and North San Jose in Santa Clara County are housing burdened, versus 62% of households, once again, in that community of Southeast LA, East Vernon, right in the heart of Southeast Los Angeles.
Wow. Here's
what the household burden looks like among the 3 neighborhood clusters in Sonoma County. And we can just see, numerically, it's highest in Santa Rosa, where about 40% of families pay at least 30% of their income on housing. And lastly, I'll go ahead and speak about median household earnings before I talk to Pete. The state median for household earnings is about $81,000 in California, and you could see the deep concentration of wealth in the San Francisco Bay Area and in many coastal cities throughout the entire state. And the two extremes is that the median earnings in San Ramon and Danville is about $193,000 in income, compared to the community of USC and Exposition Park in South LA, where the median income there is about 37. Take that with a little bit of grain of salt because of the large amount of USC students there, but it also speaks to the fact that it's in the heart of South LA, which is which is a struggling community as well. So here's what the household earnings picture looks like among the 3 neighborhood clusters in Sonoma County. In Santa Rosa, it's over 81,000. In Windsor, Hillsburg, and Sonoma, it's about 95,000. And you can take out Petaluma, Rohnert Park, and Kudati, which is over $91,000. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Pete.
Thank you, Henry. You'll still need to move the slides. I think you're sharing your screen, right? Thank you. So I'm going to just take a few minutes to try and put all this in context, because we've thrown a lot of information at you. Kind of what's going on, what's happening. And so I don't know if you can go back to that slide, Henry.
Oh, sure. The previous one?
Yes. Well, you stopped sharing somehow. I don't know what happened.
Give me a second here.
You want, I can do it, but.
I can do it. Give me a second. There we go.
So that slide. So what you see here is the growth in California's GDP over the last, almost 25, 24 years or so. And then you see that California median household earnings are coming nowhere near the growth in GDP, right? And so some folks might say, well, maybe people aren't working that hard, or maybe American workers aren't that productive. You can go to the next slide, Henry, please. Here's a table showing worker productivity and compensation hourly, right, to all workers. And so you can see that somewhere in the late 70s, the link between household incomes or worker incomes, right, worker wages, and productivity split off. And so we've continued to have very productive American workers, but they haven't been seeing the gains of the growth in the economy. And most of the gains, as we know, have gone to the upper income, right? So, so if you go to the next slide, so what do you do about all this? I mean, the reason that we produce the real cost measure is so that communities can think about how to help families move up. And so we've listed some potential levers here. And these are in the order of, I'm going to go over them in the order of things that we kind of know what to do. They're technical problems. We know what the answer is, but we just have a political will problem, right? Or getting organized in society problem to actually do them. And then towards the second half of the next slide, you'll see more adaptive problems where we know there's something we need to figure out, but there isn't a technical fix to the problem yet. So if you can go back to the slide you were on, Henry, the one before this one, right?
Yep, give me one quick second.
So we want to preserve and expand health coverage, right? So it's the number one cause of bankruptcy has been, medical care costs, right? Catastrophic illness. So, the Affordable Care Act right now is up in front of the Supreme Court, and it could be struck down. And so what would happen there would mean that a lot of low-income folks who've gained coverage over the last 4 or 5 years, almost 30 million people have gained coverage, right? And that even means that's also, even with some states not doing the Medicaid expansion, states like Texas and others still haven't done it. So you could have a lot of low-income people losing health coverage, and then you could be back in the days where you see a spike in bankruptcies and so on. Another thing we could do is make sure that working families access all the income supports that they should. So CalFresh is food assistance, right? Earned income tax credit at the federal and state level, we have earned income tax credits. And as Henry mentioned, those about those before. Those are for workers, right, who are earning a wage. They get a refundable credit. They get cash back. It's meant to, it's like a dividend for working at the lower income end of the spectrum, right? Well, California every year has about $4 to $5 billion in unclaimed earned income tax credit and CalFresh food support. About a quarter of the folks eligible for each do not claim it. That's something that we could do. We could really emphasize making sure people get that. We shared earlier that households with young children struggle to make ends meet. And in particular, single moms with young kids, right? Single parents. It's usually a single mom, but there are some single dads with very young children. So if you want those parents to go back to school and build their labor power or work more hours, they've got to do something about childcare, right? And also we know their children, if they're growing up in a low-income home, may not be getting the preschool or early childhood enrichment or education that upper-income children do. So if we were to do something like expand quality childcare and preschool, that would solve two problems, right? It would really create a better future for the children and also enable the parents to either work more or build their labor power. We didn't emphasize it too much, but there are a lot of gains to education, right? And so many people are within striking distance of, say, getting their AA degree or finishing their BA, right? And if you look at our statistics, if you have an AA or a BA, you do much better than someone who only has a high school diploma, right? So if we could help everyone level up, that's something that would, I think, help people. Make work pay is, what I mean here is, for example, California has expanded its minimum wage, right? So there are, as Henry mentioned, 90% of these households have a working adult in the household. So the challenge isn't so much, hey, get a job or even work more hours. The challenge is the pay that you receive for doing that work. These are households that are doing the best they can, right? They're not trying to not work or anything. They're struggling to cobble together a household income. We need to look at ways to make work pay better for them. And before we go to the next slide, I want to say for all of these things, the point of doing the real cost measure is so that you can see who's struggling and why. So you can kind of do what we call chunking the problem into bite-sized bits, right? If you want to help, single mothers with young children, or you want to help, households led by undocumented immigrants, there are different strategies for each, right? And so you should be able to see clearly who those households are and think about what are the barriers that they in particular face so you can address them. So here's a few more advocacy levers, and then we can stop and probably, if we have time, take some questions. Protecting assets from predatory financial practices. Henry mentioned payday lending. This is something that, we see households get into cycles of debt if they have to borrow money, right? Or if they have to go to maybe a disreputable place to get an advance on their paycheck, right? And it's really hard to get out of that cycle once you're trapped in it. We could do a lot more as a society to make sure people don't fall into those predatory financial practices. We could integrate and naturalize more immigrant households, right? So, there are many households led by immigrants that are naturalized. And what we find is those households led by naturalized immigrants do just about as well overall as households led by people born here, right? So there's something about citizenship and getting people citizenship that helps their households move up. That's something we really should look at doing, right, as a society. And I want to mention real quickly a plug for the public policy work we've been doing with Lisa's help at United Way of the Wine Country and our other members of United Way up and down the state. We advocated for the expansion of the state earned income tax credit to make it eligible for households led by an adult who files with an ITIN, an individual taxpayer ID number. So those are households led by undocumented folks. To get that state EITC, they're now going to be eligible for it. We project next year that's going to be as much as $250 to $300 million going back into the pockets of low and moderate income working families. Increase support for renters and expand the housing stock. So housing, as Henry mentioned, is a big cost factor. For statewide, our households are spending 40% or more of their income on housing. And the further you go down you go in the income scale, the greater a percentage they're spending on housing. Well, as a society, we spend $3 subsidizing mortgages for homeowners, including second homes, for every $1 we spend supporting renters, right? So that's a little out of balance. We need to flip that. And we all know in California, it's not that easy to produce more housing stock. There is a supply problem we need to look at. Then the last problem, I think, is we need to look at the changing nature of work. And this is something that doesn't just affect lower income households, but is increasingly affecting middle and upper income households. 30% of the workforce currently is involved in what we call contingent work, which the government defines as work that isn't full-time year-round with one employer. So there are a lot of people that have more than one employer, more than one job. It isn't just Uber and Lyft drivers. There are also a lot of people who are hustling on their own, right? Home healthcare workers, domestic workers, right? Or people who may work for 2 or 3 employers and they're trying to get their hours. And what we're seeing, as Henry mentioned, is it can be very hard week to week to get 40 hours of steady work. There are some jobs in some fields that are seasonal. And then with automation from software coming down the line, even upper income or professional fields, some jobs may be more at risk in terms of trying to get 40 hours. Accounting, right? Law, even some primary medical care, right? Work may be displaced or dislocated by automation, right? And so in the future, it might be harder for people to get 40 hours of steady work, and it may have less to do with their educational income level, right? Or what kind of profession they're in, as the world around us is changing. And we've built all of our social systems, right? From health coverage to retirement benefits to unemployment benefits around the model that expected somebody to work for one employer full time. And increasingly, we're not doing that. So we need to think through what that means. I'll stop there and then pass it back to Henry to show you real quickly how you can put this tool to work in your organization.
Thanks so much, Pete. So in addition to this very robust report, and you can actually take a look at it online at our website, unitedwaysca.org. We'll come back to that. I'll go ahead and come back right here to it. But here's the website, unitedwaysca.org/real cost. And here you're going to see a whole lot of interactive tools to accompany this study. So you're going to see the methodology in terms of how we put our math together, our interactive household budgets. We see interactive maps. We see county profiles. We have a public data set, which you can download in Microsoft Excel, and you can actually take a look at all the media coverage. And we'll start on our homepage. You can actually just take a look at the summary of the key findings from the real cost measure, and even test your own knowledge of poverty by taking this real cost measure quiz on the homepage. But the first thing I want to go ahead and point out are these interactive household budgets. And you can actually just use this on your mobile phone as well. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Sonoma County, and I'm going to go ahead and put in about 5 family members for this household. So I'll put in a couple of adults, 44. I'll add another 44 in there. Let's add 2 kids. Let's add in a teenager at the age of 15. Let's add a school-age child at the age of 8. And let's add a senior at the age of 75. So this family of 5 in Sonoma County with 2 adults, a teenager, a school-age child, and a senior would need almost $98,000 for the entire year to make ends meet. And when we put it monthly, that's about $8,100. So if you change any of the age numbers, especially the seniors, or especially the adults, or the ages of the children, you can actually go ahead and just see what a family would need to make ends meet here in Sonoma County. Next, I'm going to go ahead and just take you to the interactive maps. And here you see all the neighborhood clusters that I just showed you in a slide a few minutes ago. And if the internet would be working for me properly, I could just hover over any of the neighborhood clusters and it would identify the neighborhood for you. It will tell you the percentage and the number of households below the real cost measure. And there's also a little search box here. If I type in Sonoma, it'll automatically start typing in. I can just put in Sonoma County, and it will zoom into that area. I can zoom in, zoom out, hover right over your mouse, and then I can actually go ahead and just see all the areas in Sonoma County that are struggling. So in addition to the real cost measure data on this interactive map, I can also choose housing burden and median household earnings as well. So here's something that you can actually take away. We also have county profiles up on the left-hand side. Click on the drop-down menu. I'm going to go ahead and choose Sonoma County. And here you're going to find a one-page fact sheet that you can actually go ahead and use. So I'll tell you 28% of families in Sonoma County are struggling to make ends meet. And it will tell you 3 different family types in terms of 1 adult, 2 adults, 2 adults, including a preschooler and a school-age child. And it will give you a whole lot of demographic information on the bottom of the page. So something that we've added new recently are legislative profiles. So if you ever have a meeting with an elected official, such as a congressional member, or even within the state of California, a Senate district or assembly districts, or if they live miraculously down the block from you, you can engage them in terms of who's really struggling in our neighborhoods. So I took a look at the congressional district in Sonoma. I'll choose congressional district 5 as an example. So this will show the legislative boundary of congressional district 5, and it will show you the communities that are struggling within that legislative district. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, it will actually identify the neighborhoods and the percentage of families who are struggling as well. And then you can actually go ahead and take a look at all the different media articles that have credited us and publicized our study over the past couple of years as well. So that's a kind of just a high level overview in terms of some of the different interactive resources that are available with the real cost measure. And once again, that website is unitedwaysca.org/real cost. And I just want to go ahead and just say a few more words just in terms of how you can actually use this, not only engaging with friends and family, but one of my favorite ways to use this is as a financial literacy tool. So let's say you have you come home from work and you see your kid there, and he comes in, he just comes out of a football practice, and he could actually just see he's pretty much raided the refrigerator, and then 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock comes along, people open the refrigerator and there's hardly anything left. This could be a gentle intervention opportunity to educate your kid about the cost of food in the household. And while you're at it, you can actually talk about, what housing costs, what transportation costs, whatever it is that makes up your family's budget. This could be a really great opportunity to help them learn early about saving and helping to understand what it actually means to actually buy a house or just survive in California in general. This is also a great tool for nonprofits. So if you're applying for grants, we encourage you to use the real cost measure to help frame the audience for who you're trying to serve. And recently, we've been pleasantly informed that many foundations themselves are using the real cost measure as a grant-making criteria. So they would refer to our study, and they would say, they would often use the real cost measure in their RFPs, their requests for proposals, which is a great thing to see. And we see the Monterey Community Foundation and several other foundations throughout the entire state are using the real cost measure to help inform their own grant making. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and here's our contact information if you want to get a hold of me and Pete. And we're also sharing the slides out with the team. So if anybody is interested in getting the slides, we can get those out to you as well. And wow. I'll go ahead and stop the screen share right there, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, that's fantastic. Amazing amount of information, and I hope we have more time. But I really would like to ask you some questions that came from the audience. One, it has to do with the high burden of student loan debt. Is that showing in your in the studies being shown? We obviously know that for friends and family, but can you just share with us a couple of thoughts about that?
I'll take this one. And no, student loan debt is not taken into account with the real cost measure as well. But we know that's a significant barrier for many families, especially many folks who have been graduated from college over the past couple of years. And one of the things that we've learned is that many of them are actually coming back home to their parents' house and staying there because they can't afford the cost of housing, even with roommates, because of the amount of student loans that they have to pay. So that brings up a really good point, because there's other things that the real cost measure doesn't account for, because we're focusing primarily on basic needs. It doesn't account for utilities, and it doesn't also account for internet or for broadband access.
Wow.
And that latter is really critical right now for children in their ability to conduct schoolwork during the pandemic. So these are just basic needs that we're covering, but we can simply argue that those other things that we just talked about, student loans, utilities, and are basic needs as well. So if you would include that, the real cost measure could certainly be even higher for families.
Wow, that's quite intense. Another question from the audience. It says, how you guys are factoring inflation into, the figures are being looked into, and if that inflation figures are different from the different areas, different counties.
Yeah, so inflation would, Pete, do you want to take that?
No, go ahead, Henry.
Okay, yeah, so we calculated the real cost measure for the year that we conducted. So we would use, we conducted, if we were to put on a real cost measure study now, we would probably use the previous year's data. So the inflation figures would pretty much be calculated from year to year, from 2016 cost of living to 2019, but we're now doing year-to-year analysis. So in the real cost measure dashboard that we have on our website, you can actually take a look at the real cost measure from, I believe, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. So you can actually take a look at how the real cost measure has changed over time. So in that case, we don't even have to adjust inflation because we're not making year-to-year jumps.
Wow. And another member of the audience is asking, something that really caught my attention as well, is the fact that because we're spending so much money somewhere else, what's left for retirement, it's almost zero. And that's going to just generate more problems down the road. What do you foresee that, becoming more intense with the pandemic, but also the fact that since we're not saving for retirement? Any ideas, any comments regarding that matter?
I'll
Pete,
take a try at that one. Yes, many of these households are not saving for retirement, and one possible solution is to increase access to retirement in the workplace. So if people are able to save a little bit out of every paycheck, they're more likely to save. And what we find is there are about 7.5 million workers in California that currently don't have access to retirement savings in the workplace. They can't do payroll deduction. So we are working with a program called Cal Savers, which is a state-supported retirement program that is on a rolling basis being required to be offered by employers. If they don't have retirement offerings already, they need to offer Cal Savers to their workers. So that's one place. But it's, it's a significant issue in terms of the racial wealth gap, right? It has what kind of retirement savings do you have? And for many households, the wealth they have isn't as much as in retirement as it is in owning a home. And as we see so many families in California, that with the high cost of housing, not being able to buy or build an asset like that, that's a factor too.
Got it. And the last question I'm going to ask, because it's come about 3 times, since the census was so abruptly stopped, is that going to affect the way you guys can gather that information? Can you share with us, your take on that?
Well, I'll start the answer and then Henry can chime in. We don't know, right? And so the participation rate in California wasn't that bad actually this time around, especially given the fact that we went to all online. And the state invested a lot of money and effort trying to do outreach to people. Now, we still could have had better results. And what happens all the time is hard to reach communities, hard to count communities, overwhelmingly lower income communities, communities of color, communities that need to be reached in language are undercounted. That's a challenge. California has tried to do what it could to fix that. And there may be opportunities actually to supplement or address our count as a state in the next couple of years if we find that there's significant flaws at the federal level. I don't know if you wanted to add something to that, Henry.
Yeah, that's right. So the neighborhood clusters that we just looked at, they're probably going to change with this new 2020 count as well. So we're going to be paying attention in terms of how neighborhoods are being counted. And we're also going to be paying curious attention in terms of how many Californians have moved out and how many have moved in to go ahead and shape what comprises the real cost measure as well. So this also includes what ethnicity looks like as well. We know that in California, about 8% of the state's population is comprised of African Americans. We're curious to see how those changes, how that changes over time as well.
Amazing. I got the green light for 2 more questions, which is fantastic. One
Great.
has to do with the fact that this fear with the new immigration policies, have you guys seen how that's making less attractive for immigrants to apply to programs that they are entitled to? That fear of, oh my God, if I apply for food stamps or health assistance,
right?
They're saying, please do not go there because you may get in trouble for your immigration status.
Yeah, we can see the evidence of that is pretty stark, right? So the number of uninsured children in California has gone up significantly the past couple of years. And in California, all low-income children, regardless of immigration status, are eligible for Medi-Cal, right? But the numbers of enrolled children, of unenrolled children, uninsured children have been going up. And we think it's pretty clearly that households don't want to enroll their kids because of fear. And one other anecdote, we saw this right away, early 2016, right after the election. We happened to have a board member from Target who told us that year over year sales from the same store plummeted around Thanksgiving that year. And they attributed it significantly to the fear around immigration, right? So yes, that is a challenge. That is happening.
Wow. Wow.
It has a big impact in terms of the numbers that we calculate for the real cost measure, because the undocumented, they don't report taxes, right? So if they don't have that information, we could easily imagine the real cost measure being at a higher rate.
Of course. And another kind of question has to do with single parent households. Common sense will say it's a lot harder to make it, but the impact and the emergency that those people are facing. Yeah. What's your take on that as well? Just briefly, if you can share with us.
Yeah, I just mentioned earlier that single moms are heroes. They're not only the breadwinners, but their emotional support system for their kids, and they're often working various hours throughout the entire day and throughout the entire week. So sometimes they're not there to make sure that their kids are doing their homework at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They're often not there to tuck them in at night. Because of the various hours as well. And that's probably even accentuated now more with the pandemic for those single moms who are in the healthcare industry, who are spending so much time right now in the hospitals trying to help patients, not only with their COVID diagnoses and everything else. A lot of them are single mom parents. So we're very sensitive in terms of the sacrifices that they make every day and their ability to make ends meet. And not only that, within, also in hospice centers, in senior age centers, where those jobs are pretty low income jobs.
Amazing. With that, I really want to say thank you. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Peter. Thank you to Lucien. Thank you to Lisa. Thank you to all my fellow board members. We like here at Lucien to really make it a call to action. And I feel that one really simple way to do it is check the website, because information is power. And we really need to understand we're going through a crisis. We're going through a crisis. Find out more what the United Way is doing locally. Donate, get involved, volunteer. It's been an amazing experience. Not just talking on my behalf, but the rest of the people. And also for the people attending, thank you for your questions. Thank you for being there with us. Finally, I also would like to say that Los 100, we pride ourselves of being this bridge between all kind of institutions. So we also have our website, and it's www.los100.org. And I'm going to encourage you to look at that. And you know, there's a membership drive that we're starting. So please look into that. Let us help you continue to do the work we're doing. But one more time, Henry, it's been an amazing experience. I appreciate your knowledge. Peter, the same on for you. We're delighted, and I don't know if there's anybody else has some questions, but that's all I had to say as of right now. It's been fantastic. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much. We really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it, Fernando. Thank you, Oscar and Lisa.
Great.